Hi, this is Dr. Otto Janke with the Empire Longevity Podcast. You know, we bring you some of the best leaders in the longevity space from around the world. And today we're going to dive into something which I love talking about. And Americans, Dr. Joe is going to talk about this more. I don't know if people around the world do as bad as us, but Americans screw up sleeping so dramatically bad. It is incredible. And a short time ago, I brought you a article which rated what's the best for you: great nutrition, great exercise, or great sleep. And it was great sleep was hands down the most important stuff you could ever have, because if you don't do that correctly, the other two don't even matter. Today, our special guest is Dr. Joseph Zelk, all the way from, Joe, where are you from?
Portland, Oregon.
Portland, Oregon. Holy cow. He's from Portland. I'm in Cortland, New York. We just made what's great today. And let's start off. How'd you get into sleep? Because I'm sure that it's fascinating. And how do so many Americans just screw this up?
There's so many ways. It's almost hard not to find ways that we actually do a good job maintaining sleep. I got into this field from the cardiovascular vantage point many years ago. Back in, I think it was 2001, I was seeing a patient who was in his late 30s, and he was in for right heart failure, and he had this weird contraption next to him called a CPAP machine. Sure. And I'm like, what's up with this, buddy? And then we're going through his whole health history, and he was diagnosed with severe sleep apnea. And I was like, wow, this is a part of our differentials that we're not really discussing with patients regarding systemic hypertension, atrial fibrillation, heart attack, stroke, cardiovascular health in general. And at that point, in the late 1990s, we knew that sleep problems could affect your function and alertness, but we had no clue the severe impact it had on the physiology of our body, the nervous system, the endocrine system, the cardiovascular system, you name it. Sleep is there to fix all of those if you do it right. And if you do it wrong, it can make all those areas deficient. So that got me going down a rabbit hole, and I thought this will be fantastic. I don't know of any sleep specialists back then, and so I, pivoted and got into sleep disorders and underwent my residency and my postgraduate training and became a sleep specialist, and now I'm double board certified and really loving the arena of sleep. And that being said, we have lots of things we need to tackle in sleep. In general, just sleep, quality promoting aspects of our lives. But there's also a lot of disorders out there, and they're growing every year. They're adding it onto the classification of sleep disorders manuals. I think we're up to over in the 90s of different maladies there. But the primary ones are going to be insomnia and sleep apnea, and then movement disorders. So those are our three top ones. So I got really interested in the area of sleep apnea, and it's still by far the largest amount of energy that's being put into sleep disorders, is trying to catch up with the massive amount of breathing problems in sleep. And then now we add on technology and all these other things we do to make our lives imbalanced by increasing our stress levels. Now our nervous system can't actually get into sleep. So there's really a lot we're going to learn about ourselves by investigating this 1/3 of our life. So now it's almost 20 years later, and I've been doing a lot of sleep consultations. I have ventured into inventing products, these things called mandibular advancement devices, which is an alternative to CPAP. I've been really lucky to be exposed to really forward-thinking healthcare providers like chiropractors and functional medicine docs and osteopathic doctors and dentists who really want to do whole body health, and they want to do that without rushing to the pill. And I don't mind prescribing medication. And surgeries and medications are extremely important, but if you could maintain the body to the optimum level, whatever you do with it, as far as modern medical inputs, you're going to respond better, and if you can put that off as long as possible, why not, right?
So first of all, I have many, many questions for you. First of all, has we as a species always had difficulty sleeping, or is this a manifestation of the last couple decades?
Yeah, it's a modern problem. It's a modern problem. We've been very good sleepers until we put some weird inputs in there. So, well, let's walk back and get some interesting factoids. Okay, so all living creatures have some form of sleep. Okay, there is no living organism that we've found, even bacteria, that don't have like a quiet time. All mammals have some level of non-REM and REM sleep. They have this sort of very, very similar sleep cycles. And if you go and you Google any number of animals, even the ones you would think, how can they get into a relaxed sort of sleeping position? You'll see a giraffe that's standing, 15 foot tall, and then when they go to sleep, their neck's all slumped on the ground, and they're in this very vulnerable position. There has to be something that's balancing your nervous system and recovering the whole organism during that sleep process. So that's our restoration system. So just in the last 120 years, we have been monitoring just through basic surveys. In like 1900, the average worker would sleep about, or be in bed at least about 9.5 hours, because there was less access to light. It was very expensive to have electricity, and candles were expensive. And so much of that time they're sleeping, right? So about 90% of the time that we are in bed, we typically want to be sleeping. That's a good sleeper. And when you hit 1950, still, the hardest working generation, the golden generation, the hardest workers, the work ethic that we all know about as Americans, their average was about 8.5 hours, right? So it didn't drop very much. And then you move into the 70s, it came down to 7.5 hours, and now in the 90s and 2000s, and even now, the average person is sleeping 6.25 hours. So we've literally shaved off almost a third of our sleep content. Imagine breathing a third of your oxygen content, or eating a third of your food intake. It's really drinking a third of your water. You'd be constantly thirsty, you'd be constantly hungry. And that's what we're dealing with now, is this insidious sort of typical. Now, remember, things that we're dealing with nowadays are typical, but not normal, right? So we have to recalibrate our brains.
Yes.
So for, all of humanity, because we didn't have access to these ways to shift and manipulate our environment, right? The fancy word in sleep medicine is called a Zeitgeber. A Zeitgeber is basically a stimulus that will encourage some entrainment and focus or alertness, say light in the morning, the smell of a good meal when you're hungry, conversation of a very stimulating, like this podcast, a very stimulating conversation is going to get you interested and more alert and focused on whatever the content is, versus getting sedated and somnorific and falling asleep, right? So now we have all these artificial Zeitgebers. We've got light, we've got LED lights, and it turns out that certain wavelengths of light are much more capable of forcing you to physiologically be awake and not allow you to physiologically get into sleep. Like LED and blue wavelength and white wavelengths. We have a habit of trying to squeeze in our personal time later in the day, because we've been so busy with other things that we feel that we're not, me time. And so now we're trying to extend our amount of wake time until that absolute point where we want to crash and fall asleep. And so we don't give ourselves that opportunity to gradually, I call it a sleep sort of sleep out promoting hour, right? A chance to get bored and relaxed and just naturally transition into sleep, right?
So I actually have a sleep. You're talking about like a sleep regiment. For instance, I start my regiment at 9 o'clock so I can be asleep by 10 o'clock.
Yeah, that's one example. Yeah. Or even being regimented in your sleep schedules too. If you're varying, say you're traveling for business and you're crossing time zones, your circadian rhythm is important. Remember, those are the three things we're looking at in sleep. Is we're looking at sleep inertia, sleep pressure, the homeostatic drive. We're looking at the circadian rhythm, which is your 24-hour cycle. And then we're looking at the flip-flop switch. We're looking at the, there's actually physiologic mechanisms deep in the brain that have kind of a seesaw mechanism. The more you get closer to flipping the switch, boop, now you're into this phase of functionality. Boop. So there's these different aspects biologically, and none of that has to do with the higher brain, right? This is all deep brain processes. The way that the higher brain can worsen things is that you're constantly ruminating about things and you're anxious about things, and that basically just drives your system into a sympathetic or fight or flight state, and you can't be there and physiologically get into sleep. You have to gradually get into that close to parasympathetic, and then the flip-flop switch allows you to biologically get there. So yeah, sleep time has dramatically changed in modern times, just in the modern times alone.
Is there a need? Is there a certain amount we should have from being a baby to being a senior? I mean, does the 9-month-old need much more than the 90-year-old?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There is actually pretty good lifespan diagrams that show you the sleep required even in newborns versus infants versus toddlers versus preschoolers. And it starts off at like almost 16 to 20 hours a day in infants, and then it graduates down to 16, 14, 12, and then by your grade school you're still needing about 9 to 10 hours, and that's still true for developing brains, because even in middle school and high schoolers they should be closer to the high 8s and 9s if they're trying to help with brain development. And as you get to be an adult, 8's really good average. 7 is
But we're not coming close to that, though.
No, we're not. We're nowhere near that. And all of the recent science that we've been in sleep medicine and sleep research has been, you get below 6.5 hours, and all of the wreckage of inflammation and sympathetic imbalance. I mean, you name it. It starts to wear down the physiology, and so we're not going to be living our best lives. We'll be relying on more and more of the medications and the things we do to manage side effects of aging and inflammation. Why not focus on trying to do the one thing that we know is going to improve everything? Now, one other side point here. There's many things in our lives that we know are hormetic, right? Exercise is an extremely powerful hormetic stimuli where you stress the body and the body will recover and get stronger due to that constant exposure to that, right?
Right.
Calorie restriction, intermittent fasting. If you reduce your calorie intake, we do know that you have a longer lifespan. A lot of these factors that we know that if we stress the body responds in a healthy fashion. There have been no documented studies that have shown any level of positive hormetic response to disrupting sleep.
I imagine.
There's nothing. I mean, it's not like exercise. I can't get by with 6 hours sleep and my body physiologically needs 7.5. And I'm going to get stronger and better at being sleep deprived. No, you are just worse. And just like alcohol, we've learned this in just modern times. Back in the 1940s, you'd hear grandpa say, yeah, I drive better when I have a beer, and nowadays we gasp. We're like, what do you mean? You're gonna run into people.
What was the family stories at your house, Joe?
I'm not kidding you, man. If you go back far enough, people go, yeah, I just drive more relaxed. There's no real big deal. And nowadays we're just flabbergasted that people thought that way. It was like, no big deal. Alcohol is part of our normal lives. But the reason why I tell you that is alcohol is a sedative.
Right.
And the more inebriated you are, the less capable you are of accurately assessing your logical state, right?
Right.
And this is also true for other states of sleepiness. So if you're chronically sleep deprived, you get into this false narrative where you think that you're better trained of dealing with being just this tired person. But it turns out that if you do psychomotor vigilance tests, you actually are horrible. The more sleep deprived you get, the worse you get at your ability to both assess whether you're alert and even be able to perform the tasks that you normally would if you were well rested.
Right.
So now, as a culture, we're under these false impressions that, no, this is how I function well here. And the minute someone says that, you know that they're inaccurate, and you could prove it with a simple test if they were, had the time to do it.
So, okay, let's go back on a couple of those. One is then, first of all, does it matter if I do all my sleep in one long 8-hour chunk?
Good question. Good question. And these are very common questions. And maybe this is a good follow-up on the podcast, is just ask people to throw questions out that we didn't get to. And we can always, because this is very typical. After a podcast, there's like a bazillion questions. And people can be like, oh, that was a good question. That was a good question. We didn't get to it. We could always do a follow-up on that in the future. But so long story to, well, actually, let's try to simplify the answer because it's pretty complex. So your body runs on a 24-hour cycle-ish. Okay, we are trained to a 24-hour cycle-ish circadian rhythm. They found years ago that by putting a bunch of grad students in a cave for many weeks, that actually, if you don't have any exposure to Zeitgebers, like we talked about, like light, we will actually drift another about 0.4 hours-ish past the 24 hours. So literally in a month, we could be totally flipped opposite to what our normal daytime, nighttime is, because we need those Zeitgebers to know where we are geolocated, essentially. It's our GPS. So that's one aspect, is you need to stay focused on your 24-hour cycle. Typically, we're awake for about 16 hours, and that allows us to be asleep for about 8 hours. So that's the general sort of balance there in the 24-hour cycle. When you're the longer you're awake, the more basically pollution of metabolism develops into the brain. And one of those metabolites of metabolism that the brain is keeping track of is something called adenosine. And adenosine is a byproduct of cleaving our energy molecule of ATP, right? So when you use ATP to generate a metabolic function, you get ADP, or 2 adenophosphates, and then 1 adenosine kind of floating around there. So the adenosine, it kind of turns into like this little exhaust of metabolism. And there's sensors in the brain that keep very close eye of that. And if you are a fan of any caffeinated beverages, caffeine is the most powerful blocker of adenosine. So it's an adenosine blocker, and that's how it gets your alertness back. Is it will, if you're not getting rid of your exhaust, it kind of is a crutch to to get by, even though you're not getting rid of the pollution and the metabolism. So as you go to sleep, as you're awake longer, you get higher and higher pressure, what we call homeostatic drive. And the longer you're awake, the more pressure eventually you develop to want to naturally fall asleep. And then later in that cycle, where it's about an hour or two before your normal habitual sleep start time, you'll start to get a little bit of increase in melatonin from the pineal gland, and that's triggered by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the part of the hypothalamus that actually tells us, it's above the retinal pathways, but it's in that same general area. That's what's telling us, hey, it's dark out, there's no more light, it's time to go to bed, because we're diurnal creatures, right? We stay awake during the day typically, and we fall asleep at night. So that whole sort of neurotransmitter conversation is allowing us to physiologically get prepared for sleep. And then what happens is, and I'll give you a little bit of a comprehensive assessment of sleep cycling, because I think this gives you more information on what you're really asking about, is do we need to sleep in 8-hour chunks? So it takes, typically, if you have the right amount of rest, about 10 to 15 minutes to get bored enough and relaxed enough to start to drift away and sleep. If you're finding it takes you a minute or 30 seconds, That's wrong. That's not good. That's called pathologic sleepiness. So very, very many people just finally get to bed and are so exhausted they crash and they go to sleep within like 30 seconds. They go, yeah, I've always been a strong sleeper. No, you are a bad sleeper.
Well, I'm a bad sleeper.
You're a bad sleeper, which is most of us, right? Because most of us kind of push it, and just only get to bed when we're absolutely ready to collapse.
But
So
I thought I was a champion of the team, though.
that is the most common misconception I hear every day in my practice.
So let's go back that for a second, because I thought I was absolutely the best sleeper because I can go to bed. It doesn't matter what time it is. And my head hits the pillow. And if I'm not asleep by then, I'm amazed. I mean, my wife hates it that I can sleep. You know, I'm out. The other night I was awake for like 3-4 minutes, and that's insomnia for me.
Isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? Because again, you learn to feel what's typical for your pattern, but it's not normal. And that is the problem we're having to get past right now is people go, oh, this is my typical. Doesn't mean it was normal. Doesn't mean it's healthy. So if you're falling asleep that quickly, you have such an intense amount of homeostatic drive to fall asleep that you're actually not filling your tank fully. It's like you're going to the gas station and you're supposed to give yourself 15 gallons, and Dr. Otto's constantly only giving himself 14 gallons. And he's driving that whole 15 gallons and he's almost making it to the final destination, and you just made it over the finish line, right?
Right.
just rolled over the finish line. It just means that you don't have enough gas, right? So that's very typical. If you're getting adequate sleep, physiologic sleep, you should be able to lie down and say, this is relax time. I'm going to read a book, or just kind of lie here and get comfortable. And then gradually over 10 to 15 minutes, lull yourself into sleep biologically. So absolutely most common point I hear as a clinician, this is something in preventative health that you got to be on point with, is that's going to be stated all the time by your patients, and they're going to be lulled in a false sense of sleep superiority, right? So no, you are actually, you cannot get good quality sleep. You can go unconscious very well. It's like saying, hey, I'm great at blacking out,
That was a couple of decades ago, Joe.
Yeah, exactly. So no, that's a common misconception. So 10 to 15 minutes if you are sleeping appropriately and your body's functioning appropriately in the day, night, sleep, wake cycle. Then once you fall asleep, we used to have labels for non-REM sleep and REM sleep that were non-REM 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then REM. Now it turns out that we've lumped together the deep sleep stages into non-REM 3 and 4 into non-REM 3. Okay, so I'll go through this again. Only about 5 to 10% of your night should be in stage 1 sleep, non-REM. About 60% should be in intermediate sleep, which is stage 2. About 10 to 15, maybe 20% if you're younger, should be in delta sleep or slow wave sleep or deep sleep. That happens usually within the first hour and a half of your sleep cycle. And then every 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the patient, you'll get a little bit of REM sleep, which is dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And then it will continue to get longer and longer chunks of REM sleep as you sleep longer. So that last hour of sleep is largely, if everything's working well, REM sleep. So this comes to your question, right? Is if you're shaving off those 8 hours and you're only getting 7 hours, what's happened to your percentage of REM? It should have been 25% of your night. Now it's only 10%. Now it's only 12%. REM is how we consolidate memories. It's how we learn. It's how we engage our short-term memory. It's how we manage our anxiety. Our mood. It's just so inherently important to how our, brains, our advanced brains work. So if you're constantly shutting off your REM sleep, even if you had a good chunk of 7 hours, you're missing on part of the recipe for a good, healthy sleeper. So That being said, there's lots of ways of measuring that to see if you are physiologically that person that can get by with, say, 7 hours, 7.5 hours. So let's go back to the staging. So non-REM stage 1 is light sleep. It should only happen for that little transitional point where you're going from I'm here, bored, and I'm falling asleep. That first, what we call sleep onset latency. The amount of time it takes to lie down and then to transition to sleep is called sleep onset latency. That's 10 to 15 minutes, right? If you have insomnia and it's more than an hour, you have a prolonged sleep onset latency, and that's something we have to address in sleep consultation, right? And so then once you transition past stage 1, you'll go into stage 2, and you'll be there for a short while, and then you'll get into a good chunk of delta sleep, which is slow wave sleep. And that is it has a very specific job. Delta sleep does a lot for physiologic restoration, okay? We've found that your liver actually does a lot of gluconeogenesis and forms glycogen, and that you need a storage of glycogen in your liver. So you have backup energy storage in case you ever had to intermittent fast or not be exposed to food. Right. So you need an energy source. So that happens in slow wave sleep, okay? So that also means that if you're not getting slow wave sleep, you're going to have dysfunction in the endocrine system that's trying to manage that glucose metabolism. And hence we've had this problem with what we call type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance. This is a large correlation with not just nutritional intake and inflammatory foods, but also a sleep imbalance, right? And we've shown this in experimental testing that if we disrupt not just sleep time, you say you slept the normal amount, but we made it so when we noticed on a polysomnogram that you were going into slow wave sleep, that we just disrupted enough, annoyed the brain enough that it wouldn't let you go into slow wave sleep. You were still asleep, but you weren't getting that nice restorative slow wave sleep. Within very short order, your blood glucose levels will start to go to diabetic levels.
Wow.
Your blood pressure starts to elevate. Your inflammatory markers start to go up, and your immune system drops. So physiologically, this is super, super important to be a healthy person, is you've got to get that slow wave sleep. And unfortunately, as we get older, we get less of it. And that's one of the reasons why our immune system is not as strong, right? So that's a big chunk. And that's the hardest one to mess up because we always, even insomniacs will say, well, once I got to sleep, that first few hours, I stayed pretty heavy, pretty deep. And then you'll get a little jump of REM sleep within about an hour, hour and a half for a very short period of time. And then you're right back into intermediate sleep, which is non-REM stage 2, which is theta. And then you go into a little chunk of non-REM delta sleep maybe, and then you'll get REM. And then for the rest of the night, every 69 minutes, you're going stage 2 REM, stage 2 REM. And the normal sleeper should get about 4 to 5 cycles of that non-REM REM cycling. Okay. So if your brain's capable of getting that, is
that going to be the dream phasing that we're talking about?
Absolutely. REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, is dreaming, which is essentially awake internally.
So we all dream, no matter if we don't remember it.
Exactly. This is a very important point here, is almost all of us, if we do remember dreams, are actually only remembering the last dream interval.
Sure.
Because if I wake you, and again, we've done a lot of, unfortunately, experimented a lot of folks over the years on in-lab testing facilities. Poor graduate students just need a couple bucks or credit.
That's all.
Yeah, that's all. So on a polysomnogram, we can look at electroencephalographic data. This is the brain waves. This is what I've been telling you about with deep and light and REM sleep. So this is an interesting point. Back in the very beginning of sleep research, Dr. Bill Dement, who we consider the godfather of sleep, in Stanford, I believe they did a lot of initial sleep experiments. And when they were just doing EEG assessment, and no one really, even neurologists weren't really familiar with what brain waveforms looked like back then. There was this point where you go very small, very active, very fast moving brain waves, and then it gets slower and slower. And then in the middle of the night, all of a sudden, the brain waves got really fast again. And the sleep researchers were like, is this guy faking that he's asleep? And they try to wake them up, hey, wake up, and they wouldn't respond. And they would go in and try to arouse them. And it's very, very hard to arouse someone from sleep when they're in REM sleep. You're just so disconnected. And it turns out that your brain waves mimic very, very closely what it looks like when you're awake.
Sure.
In REM sleep. So REM sleep is basically internal awakeness, right?
Yeah,
And it
wild.
has a lot to do with what you're trying to do with your memories and and what you've been exposed to throughout the day. And what a lot of researchers believe is that it's trying to basically clean up and organize the hard disk of the brain and make sure you can actually remember the important things and you're forgetting the unimportant things, right? And you're also triggering or associating your experiences with either emotional or logical thought processes, right? So hippocampus is going to be logical, and then amygdala is going to be stress response related stuff. So you got to know if you ran up against a bear, the next time you go against a bear, if you survived, that it's a stress response,
Sure.
Or if you go talk to a stimulating whomever person, poet, and you loved it, and you want to remember that and have a good experience with that again. So dream sleep is really, that's its function. Most researchers believe is its function primarily, but it's so odd because in dream state, typically what you're dreaming is fanciful,
right,
not based in fact, oftentimes delusional. I mean,
that's my daytime.
yeah, you're losing track of time. So essentially, every human being is going through a delirium and basically insanity every night. So,
so Joe? What's it mean to me if I've had repeat scenarios and I call them characters in my sleep?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Mine repeat. I can almost name. There's people I know. I sleep so well that sometimes I think this right here is the sleep time, and that the sleep time is actually the real life.
So the vividness of it is what you're saying.
Dramatically vivid.
Dramatically vivid. So before we go there, let's finish off on the REM aspect there. So in REM sleep, the final thing that I didn't mention was physiologically. The other way they found out people were actually in REM sleep back when is it turns out that you are physically paralyzed
right
every night. And that's so that if you do happen to dream, you don't act it out, because it literally is awake internally.
Awake internally.
Yeah, and there's actually disorders out there, especially in like people who are on the verge of developing Parkinson's, called REM behavior disorder, where there's a part of the reticular activating system that's injured, and they're actually able to act out their dreams. And it's pretty scary looking when someone's doing it, and typically usually in a fight or flight experience where they're trying to fight off somebody, or there's something very, very stressful. And you'll actually see, and we've recorded these on video EEG polysomnography, where that person is literally, fighting and punching and kicking, and until finally there's some pain response, it jolts them out of sleep, and they realize, oh God, I broke my toe. Wow. And you have bed partners who are getting punched and kicked, and they're like taking it personally. This is not about you. And so in REM sleep, we're paralyzed. We can't manage our body temperature very well. We call it poikilotheria, where your body temperature is actually going to be more related to your ambient temperature in the room. So what's the problem with REM sleep, when we kind of step it back to other potential currently modern common problems, because this is not common throughout human history, but modern humans have to deal with these smaller jaws and smaller airways and smaller nasal passages. And we tend to have a worsening of breathing in the periods of time that we get into REM sleep, early in the progression of sleep apnea.
Right.
So if your muscles are relaxing throughout your whole body, they're also going to relax in your airway. And if your airway is already kind of small, you're going to have more frequent airway collapse in that REM period prior to any other part of your sleep, whether you're on your back, your side, deep sleep. But REM sleep's where you early on start to find it starting to occur. And this is not uncommon to hear patients report. Sorry, my coffee machine's turned off. Patients report that either phenotypically one of two things. Doc, I sleep really hard, but I never remember my dreams.
Sure.
Or, Doc, I sleep really hard and I got these crazy dreams, and I've always been a crazy dreamer, and I always remember these really vivid dreams. And then half the people are like, these are fun, and half the people are like, these suck, I hate them. And so phenotypically, this is something we have to rule out when we're looking at sleep disorders. Is there something that's causing a weirdness in the sleep dream physiology? And when I say weirdness, I say there's aspects to people's sleep that phenotypically are different between each individual. The first one is the arousability of sleep. Some people can go out and stay out, and it's typically a guy, not 100%, but it's definitely a testosterone estrogen sort of influence a little bit, where in male patients, you'll tend to hear, oh, I'm out and I stay out, even if they're not sleeping healthy, right?
Yep.
And so your arousal threshold is harder to disrupt. And in folks who, and again, this is not 100%, but there is a typical gender pattern here where the estrogen influence for many female patients is that there's a more arousability there. There's a easier ability to disrupt them from staying in sleep. And then there's just in general people who are more arousable. So those are folks that might recall their dreams later in the sleep period. And then you have other folks who don't really remember much of the dreaming until that very last period, that very last hour. And that's very, very typical. And we hear this very commonly if we do find a sleep problem, like a sleep apnea problem, and we've corrected their sleep apnea problem that's causing their adrenaline levels to really spike in REM sleep, that can influence the sleep narrative, right? Your dream narrative. If I have a little epinephrine here, and this has been another unfortunate sleep experiment, and I see you on a sleep study and you're going into REM sleep and you're really relaxed and there's no problems, and I go, time to give Otto a shot of adrenaline.
A shot, huh? Yeah.
All of a sudden, and I give you, maybe 5-10 minutes into that, 20 minutes, and I wake you up right out of REM sleep. People can remember their dreams vividly, right when they've been aroused right out of REM sleep. You'll probably say to me how weird your dream got. It was very odd and not comfortable, and now you're feeling kind of anxious, your heart rate's elevated, and you're almost angry. And it's because the hormones of stress were high in your system during that period of dream, and that would switch or tweak your actual dream narrative. Now, that being said, there's a lot of philosophy on dream interpretation. And you having dreams about those specific people could be a number of things. They could have been paramount, pivotal periods in your life. It could be something that you just remember vividly in the amygdala, and it becomes a representation of other things in your life when you're trying to manage stress. But more importantly, and by far the easiest to fix, is to look for the reason why our adrenaline levels increase in sleep, in dreaming. And if you're hearing what I've been saying, I'm going to be encouraging people to be looking at the elephant in the room, which is lack of oxygen in sleep, which is undiagnosed sleep apnea in 85% of us. So we've got to really look at this as a big, big part of our health partnership with our patients is do not ignore very common sleep abnormalities that will manifest themselves as these questions as you're having about dream and whatnot,
Let me give you a couple quick hitters from you right now. I can get my 8 hours, but I can't do it necessarily at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. Doesn't matter what time I go to bed as long as I get the same 8 hours.
It's individual. There's been a couple of sleep specialists who've written some books out there, and they've come up with their ways of kind of labeling people in how they fit within the 24-hour sleep cycle. And there are those larks who are early birds, and there are those night owls who are later in later in the rhythm there. And there's the typical sleep pattern there. Now, mind you, this does change throughout our lifespan. So when you're younger, you actually have, when you're super young, you have an early sleep cycle, right? So you have an advanced sleep phase. And then as you get into high school and young adulthood, you actually drift into more of a delayed sleep phase where you're more of a night owl. And then you kind of develop your own sleep pattern based on your own genetics and your own environment throughout adulthood. And then once you start to age into middle adulthood and older, you will gradually become more of an advanced sleep phase or earlier bird, so more of a lark. And that's not uncommon to see that. That's why you always make fun of, early bird specials, for grandma and grandpa, because their circadian rhythm has changed.
I love those.
Yeah. Are those yummy?
But Joe, if I go from 8 o'clock last night to 10 o'clock tonight to 9 o'clock tomorrow, as long as I'm still getting my 8 hours, doesn't matter what time I actually hit the hay. As long as I'm fulfilling my 8 hours.
The short answer is that's fine if you're not a person who finds themselves being frustrated with insomnia.
Sure.
If you can vary your sleep onset within a few hours and you're always typically getting your 8 and you feel great and your blood pressure is great and your normal weight and your cholesterol levels are good, your blood pressure is good, your stress levels are good, typically that's acceptable. Yeah, that's acceptable.
Next one for you is eating time. Should I stop 3 hours before I go to bed?
Depends on what you're eating and how good of a diet you have. If we're leading the standard American diet or the SAD diet, you got a lot of processed foods. You got a lot of things that are, bum rushing. Kind of like, kind of mobbing the body and
the salt, sugar, fats.
The salt, sugar, fats, the hyper palatable, hyper absorbable foods are going to wreak a lot of havoc on the gut and the gut microbiome, as well as the ability for your pancreas and your liver to try to manage where the heck you're going to put all this excess calorie. So if you're eating the standard, if you're eating the standard American diet, then you definitely want to give yourself at least 3 hours between your dinner and sleep. And in general, you do much better if your larger meals are breakfast and lunch,
right?
And your smaller meal, more protein-based at nighttime. And try not to squeeze all your fluid intake later at night either. You should be squeezing your fluid intake throughout the day because the more dilute you make your food, the less able you're to fully digest the food. And this is an area too that if you're into functional medicine, you want to make sure that you're feeding the right microbiome. A lot of reflux disorders are the fact that you're just feeding the wrong microbiome. You got a higher, yeast count, or or even the less helpful bacteria, and they're generating their own byproducts, and that's what gives you that higher acid base. And so we try to mimic it, and we try to quell the side effect with proton pump inhibitors and antacids and antihistamines, and that's just a short-term thing that's going to help you out. But long-term, we got to make sure we're digesting our foods appropriately. We're got the appropriate enzymatic capability to break down our foods into their smallest capable macronutrient status there. But yeah, long story short, try to avoid eating within 3 hours. Don't make nighttime your biggest meal, and you'll do really well. Because sleep is about restoring the body, not about digestion, right? So digestion's a daytime process. You're trying to get everything into the body, and then now you got all that basic substrate. Then your sleep physiology can actually put that to good work.
As we say here, is that well known that digestion is the metabolically the most demanding process we have going on in our body. And why would you want that going on when you're trying to repair and heal the body at the same time? A very, very common mistake that a lot of people have. They say, well, I like to eat before I go to bed. And once again, you're making the machine work harder when it's trying to repair itself also at the same time. Last one for you. I'm going to ask you one question after this one, but many people say I want to have a drink or two before because it helps me to sleep better.
The most commonly used medication in the world to fall asleep is not prescribed. It's called alcohol.
Sure.
The most commonly used medication, period, in the world is not prescribed, and it's called caffeine. So both of these substances are Band-Aids, just like medications are Band-Aids. Unfortunately, with alcohol, because it's easy access, it will never be not part of our culture. It is a sedative. It will basically lull your brain into unconsciousness, but it actually does a lot of things negatively towards sleep. So there's unconscious and there's sleep. Okay, so there's natural sleep that's going to do all the things you want it to do, which is make your body healthy, get rid of pain, heal injuries, clean out the junk from the brain from metabolism, the lymphatics, we're kind of getting rid of all the byproducts in the brain of metabolism, and all those really important things to make us healthy. So you can be unconscious for a number of reasons, and people typically don't wake up from surgery even though they were unconscious and go, wow, that was great sleep. Because it wasn't sleep, it was just unconscious.
Right.
And so unfortunately sedatives, and we're finding this is a very recent shift in sleep management, is we're really trying to push people to get away from medications that mimic sedation and unconsciousness that actually worsen our restorative sleep processes. And as I explained to you, there's lots of things going on, right? There's cycles of sleep going on. There's different physiologic functions happening during each part of those things. And if you don't get to that point, it's like you have a reset and you got to start all over from the beginning. So the challenge with alcohol is manifold. The first one is it's got a pretty short half-life.
Right.
Meaning that if you have a few drinks and it sedates you, then as it's getting metabolized vigorously by the liver, which the liver can't do its other jobs now, right? Then what's happening is now you're going to be in a state of hyperarousability later in the night. And a lot of folks will say, well, yeah, I went right to sleep, but then I woke up too early, couldn't go back to sleep.
Right.
And that's because you are hyperarousable, because now this artificial sedative is out of your system. Secondly, when you drink alcohol or take any sedation, and I'm sorry for sounding like a broken record, you are going to make the airway more collapsible, and you can actually worsen sleep apnea by 2 to 3-fold. So if you have mild sleep apnea that's undiagnosed on the night that you've had several good cocktails and you've enjoyed your social hour, then you could literally worsen your apnea by 2 to 3 times, which could easily put you into the severe category. And now you're going hypoxic or low oxygen. You're getting constant little arousals or little fragmentations is what we call them, little chopping up episodes of your sleep continuity. And you can actually, that's a lot of reasons why people wake up with the hangover, is they've had lots of hypoxia and their brain's like, I feel like you've been beating me up with a bat here.
Sure.
Along with the toxin that you've had floating around the body and the dehydration of the brain that's been occurring as well. And then also you'll get a higher level of response to urine production. So you end up getting up to pee more often at nighttime. And it also suppresses REM sleep. So oftentimes if someone's been drinking, they'll say, oh yeah, I remember really vivid dreams. Well, usually it's because it kept suppressing all those initial REM periods. And then you had this huge chunk later in the sleep cycle right before you woke up. And that was that really wild dream that you remembered because your brain was trying to force you to get at least some level of REM sleep.
Fantastic.
So not good.
Fantastic. First of all, my last question is going to come up for you. But first of all, Dr. Zelk, where can people find you?
Well, I am actively on the circuit trying to be available for training. So there's a website that I've started along with Dr. Rick Downs, who's a dentist who's focused on sleep apnea training. for dentists, as well as trying to connect those dentists with chiropractors who are leading the way when it comes to whole body health and preventative health and functional medicine. And we believe that restoring sleep and sleep breathing is the foundation to health promotion. So we've got a website that we started called Sleep Balance Academy, where we're trying to bring together professionals. It does many things. It meets a lot of the criteria that a lot of state scopes of practice are asking for both chiropractic and dentistry, to get a basic fundamental knowledge of sleep physiology and sleep disorders, and how to discuss that as a general practitioner with your patients, to include that in your armamentarium for helping them stay healthy and improve their longevity. That's one area you can find me. We have a website called onlinehomesleepstudy.com, where if a patient is concerned and they've had a conversation with their chiropractor or their dentist or even their family doctor, a patient can actually go on that website and order a test without a prescription, just like you can go on many of these lab companies and order a blood cholesterol level without a prescription. You don't know how to necessarily read it, but at least you have legal accessibility to that. And if you wanted to actually review that with a clinician, you could do that after the fact via telemedicine. That's my big area of growth right now, after almost 20 years of being a very productive sleep practice here in Portland, and I'm also licensed in Washington State. I really want to be more available via telemedicine.
Sure.
So I can do telemedicine sleep coaching if you're not within my state of license, which is Oregon or Washington. I can still give you advice and guide you along that way via telemedicine, or if you actually need a prescription or some official medical management, I can do that within the areas of Oregon and Washington.
Sure.
And you can find me on sleepmedicinegroup.com, where you can, I have a little calendar scheduling link where you can hop on there and give me a little bit of background information, see where you are in your sleep journey. So those are two areas that you can find me when you're looking for more advice regarding sleep. Awesome. And sleep problems. Yeah.
Dr. Joe Zelk is our sleep czar of the Empire Longevity. And, our last question for you now is, we define longevity in Empire Longevity as the act and intent of being so healthy that you left something great behind by what you've done today. Dr. Zelk, what's the thing you're going to leave behind? What's that the great thing you're going to leave behind?
Well, knowledge is primarily my mark I want to leave behind in this journey we call life. And this introduction to sleep, health, and functional medicine has been really exciting for me. And it's given me a lot more hope on how we can guide our patients and our people in our lives toward a healthier life. So that's definitely the thing that I want to leave behind, is a healthy level of knowledge and empowerment to make a difference in your life. And the more I can get someone that's within my sphere of influence to feel empowered, to be able to be healthier and be able to share that with someone else, that's ultimately my goal.
Fantastic as it is. The number of people who don't sleep well and just, we screw it up tremendously, absolutely astounding. Still, that we're in 2021 already. Come on, guys. Dr. Joseph Zelk.
Yep, that's true.
love that you're with us today. I'm sure we're going to be doing this many more times. Let's make a plan for it in the future. Our sleep czar of Empire Longevity, Dr. Joseph Zelk. We appreciate your time, your expertise, and your love for all those things that we do also. Thank you much.
You're very welcome. And I look forward to answering questions that people may end up having regarding this. And there's a lot of areas that we haven't touched yet, and things you can do about your sleep too. So
absolutely.
Now we scared you. Let's give you some tools to get better.
No, I won't be able to sleep again. Dr. Joe, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so very welcome. Oh, and real quick plug there, Otto, Dr. Otto. I want patients to look into, if we had time, we were going to go through a little bit of information that you've been collecting.
Yep.
But I want them to go on to Bodymetrics, BODIMETRICS.com.
Yep.
And learn about a really neat sleep ring that I am really excited about. People are talking about lots of things like Apple Watches and Fitbits and the Garmin's, but the two most popular, the first one right now that's getting a lot of marketing is the Oura ring, O-U-R-A. It's a great ring, but it's not as good as this guy. It's got all the functionality as a sleep doctor that I want the patient to be looking at, which is both blood oxygen saturation. This has got a medical grade. We use this same oximeter in hospitals. So it's a very high quality oximeter. It can give you an idea of if you have some level of breathing problem, so you can review that with a sleep doctor remotely. It gives you a sleep graph that's pretty well validated, so you know how long it's taking you to fall asleep. Are you waking up a lot? Are you getting deep sleep? Are you getting REM sleep?
Right.
It also has something called an ECG. It has a single lead ECG right here that you can check once a day to see if you have a normal rhythm, along with your systolic blood pressure and body temperature. And nowadays, when we're trying to make sure that we're not exposing ourselves during an infectious process, that prodrome before infection, our body temperature will increase before we're actually symptomatic. So you can actually check body temperature. So I really, really encourage them to look up Circle Plus ring. It's out at Walmart now. Prevention Magazine's really about it. This is a great way to start including sleep conversation with your chiropractor, because they're getting knowledge through our Sleep Balance Academy to learn more about this tool. And it's brand new out. It's just been launched this last month. And I'm super excited about it. It's an adjustable ring that can go on any finger.
Right.
It's water resistant, Circle Plus. If you have questions, reach out to me.
I feel a second podcast coming on.
Absolutely.
Dr. Joe, thank you so much.
Have a great one, Otto.